What if the final Neanderthals of Europe did not disappear in a dramatic last stand on the open plains, or in some famous limestone fortress overlooking the sea, but in a cold Galician cave where bears came to sleep through the winter? That is the strange power of Cova Eros. It is not the most famous Neanderthal cave in Iberia. It does not have the mythic weight of Gibraltar, or the grim violence of Cidron, or the almost theatrical symbolism of a final refuge at the edge of the continent. But in some ways that makes it more unsettling, because Cova Eros does not look like a grand ending. It looks like survival reduced to its practical essentials. A cave in the mountains of northwestern Spain, red deer moving through the valleys, cold forest and open patches beyond the entrance, stone tools left behind in a narrow window of time, and a group of late Neanderthals still using the land around 42,000 to 39,000 years ago, just as their world was supposed to be closing down. The site has been described as one of the key sequences for understanding the transition from Neanderthals to early modern humans in northwestern Iberia, with late Mousterian levels below early upper Paleolithic levels, which means it is not just a cave with bones and tools, but a stratified witness to one of the most important human turnovers in European prehistory. The cave sits in Galicia, in a region that is often overlooked when people imagine the last Neanderthals. The popular picture usually pulls the eye southward, toward Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, where warm refuges, coastal caves, shellfish cliffs and seabirds create an easy story of the final Neanderthal holdouts. But Cova Eros points in a different direction. It asks us to look at the northwestern interior, at a colder Atlantic world of valleys and mountains, where survival may have depended less on a permanent paradise and more on local pockets of stability. The late Neanderthal occupation in level 3 has been placed around 41.7 to 39,000 calibrated years before present, while nearby studies of fauna and small vertebrates reconstruct a landscape colder than today, yet not necessarily dead, dry, or empty. One recent environmental interpretation describes annual temperatures around several degrees colder than modern conditions, but with rainfall broadly comparable to the present, which matters because a cold but still well-watered environment is very different from a barren glacial desert. It could support forest patches, animals, seasonal movement, and the kind of local ecological mosaic that small human groups could exploit if they knew the terrain intimately. That detail changes the emotional temperature of the story. These were not Neanderthals trapped in a lifeless wasteland, waiting passively for extinction. They were hunter-gatherers operating inside a familiar landscape, reading animal movement, returning to known shelters, using stone technology that belonged to a long Middle Paleolithic tradition, and occupying a cave that was also part of the world of other large mammals. Cova Eros was not simply a human home. It was a shared space in the Pleistocene sense, a place used at different times by hominids, carnivores and cave bears. Excavations have repeatedly emphasized cave bear remains and evidence that bears used the cave as a hibernation shelter, while the archaeological levels also preserve signs of Neanderthal activity, including lithics and butchered fauna. That overlap is what gives the site its eerie quality. The same chamber or cave system that could shelter people could also shelter enormous sleeping bears. The same darkness that protected a human group from wind and rain might, in another season, belong to animals that outweighed them many times over. The phrase cave bear hibernation den can sound almost cinematic, but the archaeological meaning is more complicated and more interesting. Cave bears were not monsters stalking Neanderthals in a fantasy landscape. They were real ecological competitors for caves, especially in cold regions where winter shelter mattered. A cave full of bear bones does not automatically mean humans were living among bears at the same moment, but it does mean that the cave had a repeated attraction for different species over time. Bears could die during hibernation. Cubs could leave deciduous teeth behind. Carnivores could drag remains. Humans could enter after bears had gone, or avoid certain chambers, or use the cave seasonally when the risk was lower. In Cova Eros, newer zooarchaeological work has tried to refine this picture by looking beyond visually identifiable bones, using protein-based methods to classify fragments that were previously too broken to identify. That matters because If cave bear remains are overrepresented simply because bear teeth and bones preserve well, then the cave may not have been mostly a bear cave in the simple sense. It may have been a more complex place where horses, red deer, carnivores, bears, Neanderthals, and later modern humans all left different signatures in different layers. For the last Neanderthals, the key question is not whether they hid from history in a bear den, but why they were still there at all. By 42,000 years ago, Europe was changing fast. Modern human-associated industries were moving through parts of the continent. Neanderthal populations were becoming fragmented. Some regions show earlier disappearance, while others preserve late Mousterian occupations that seem to linger close to the 40,000-year threshold. Iberia has always been central to this debate because it is geographically semi-enclosed, climatically diverse, and full of potential refugia. It has mountains, coasts, river systems, interior basins, Atlantic and Mediterranean zones, and a long record of Neanderthal presence. If Neanderthals survived late anywhere, Iberia is exactly where we would expect pockets of them to persist, not as a single united population, but as scattered groups embedded in old territories. Cova Eros is powerful because it suggests that northwestern Iberia was not a dead corner of the map. It was part of this last Neanderthal geography. The evidence from Cova Eros also resists the clean replacement story. In the same cave sequence, researchers can compare Middle Paleolithic Neanderthal occupations with later early Upper Paleolithic activity, which means the site preserves not merely one population, but a changing human landscape. Levels 4 and 3 are associated with Mousterian Neanderthal occupation, while levels above are associated with early Upper Paleolithic modern human activity, including aurignation technology in level 2 around 36,000 to 35,000 calibrated years ago. That gap may look small on a geological timescale, but in human terms it is enormous. Several thousand years can contain migrations, disappearances, cultural shifts, abandoned valleys, reoccupied caves, and memories that vanish completely. The cave does not show us a neat moment when one people walks in as another walks out. It shows a sequence, and that sequence is full of silence. This is where Cidron begins to matter, even though it is not the same cave and not the same moment. Cidron lies in Asturias, also in northern Spain, east of Galicia, along the broad Cantabrian world. It is older than the final Cova Eros occupation, usually discussed around 49,000 years ago, and it is famous because it gave us something rare, not just isolated Neanderthal bones, but a group, a social unit, a biological snapshot. 13 Neanderthals have been identified from Cidron, and genetic work has shown that they were closely related enough to be treated as a kin group. This is one of the few places where Neanderthals stop being an abstract population and become almost visible as a family-level community, with adults, adolescents, juveniles and children bound together by shared ancestry, shared biology, and probably shared catastrophe. Cidron is darker than Cova Eros because the bones themselves suggest violence, processing, and possibly cannibalism. The remains were not simply laid out as burials. They were found in a jumbled context in the ossuary gallery, and the broader interpretation has long involved disarticulation, cut marks, percussion damage, and the possibility that the group was consumed by other Neanderthals before natural processes moved or sealed the bones. But beneath the violence is something even more important for the Cova Eros question. Cidron gives us a glimpse of small, isolated Neanderthal demography in northern Iberia before the final disappearance. Genetic studies found low diversity and kinship structure, while later skeletal work identified congenital anomalies consistent with inbreeding in a small, closely related group. That does not prove every late Neanderthal group in Iberia was collapsing genetically, but it gives us a warning. These were not huge, dense populations. They may have been small communities stretched thin across a difficult landscape, connected enough to survive for long periods, but perhaps not connected enough to remain resilient when climate, competition, disease, or demographic bad luck intensified. The relationship between Cidron and Cova Eros therefore should not be imagined as a direct family tree unless ancient DNA from Cova Eros eventually proves it. We do not yet have a Cova Eros Neanderthal genome that lets us say these late Galician Neanderthals were descendants of the Cidron group. But geographically and chronologically, the speculation is tempting. Cidron around 49,000 years ago and Cova Eros around 42,000 to 39,000 years ago belong to the same broad northern Iberian survival zone, separated by several thousand years and a rugged Atlantic Cantabrian landscape. If Cidron represents one local Neanderthal group in Asturias before the final phase, Cova Eros may represent the kind of remnant population that survived farther west or in related territories after similar groups had vanished. The connection may not be a straight line from one cave to another. It may be more like the last scattered lights of the same regional metapopulation, groups related through deep ancestry, intermittent mate exchange, shared Mousterian traditions, and movement along ecological corridors that linked the northern Spanish interior to the Atlantic margins. This is the more plausible and more haunting speculation. Cova Eros may preserve the archaeological shadow of the same kind of people whose bodies we meet genetically at Cidron. Not the same individuals, not necessarily the same clan, but the same late Iberian Neanderthal world. Imagine a northern Iberian landscape where small bands moved through valleys and uplands, some connected by marriage exchange, some isolated for generations, some disappearing after a bad winter, a failed hunt, a conflict, or the loss of too many reproductive adults. Cidron shows us what one of those groups looked like when catastrophe froze it into the record. Cova Eros shows us another side of the same process. Not death in a bone chamber, but continued occupation, adaptation, and the stubborn use of a familiar territory near the end of the Neanderthal story. One site gives us bodies, the other gives us persistence. The genetic evidence from Cidron makes this even more provocative because it suggests that Neanderthal social structure may have involved female movement between groups and male continuity within local bands. The famous patriarchality interpretation came from mitochondrial patterns in which the adult males appeared to share the same maternal lineage while adult females had more diverse lineages, implying that females may have moved between communities. That pattern has been debated and refined with later work from other Neanderthal sites, but it remains one of the strongest images we have of Neanderthal society as something organized, fragile, and human in the deepest sense: small groups, kinship rules, marriage-like exchanges, local males, incoming females, and the constant need to maintain links between bands. If that pattern applied broadly across late Iberia, then the survival of a group like the one at Cova Eros would have depended not just on red deer and caves, but on social geography. A small Neanderthal band could not survive indefinitely as an isolated island. It needed partners, mates, neighboring groups, seasonal meeting points, and corridors of movement. The extinction of Neanderthals may therefore have happened not only when individuals died, but when networks broke. A cave could still be usable, the deer could still be there, the tools could still work, the people could still know the valley. But if the next group over disappeared, if daughters no longer arrived from another valley, if young men could not find partners beyond their kin, if disease or conflict took out one branch of the network, then survival would begin to narrow invisibly before the archaeology showed any dramatic break. By the time we see the final Mousterian layers, the real collapse may already have happened in the social map. Cova Eros Level 3, then, may not represent a thriving Neanderthal homeland so much as a late node in a shrinking system. The faunal evidence suggests these Neanderthals exploited red deer and other animals in a cold but viable environment, and the site appears to reflect knowledge of local resources rather than desperate scavenging. But successful foraging in one valley does not guarantee long-term population survival. Hunter-gatherer groups can be excellent at surviving day to day and still be demographically doomed if their numbers fall below a certain threshold. This is one of the quiet tragedies of late Neanderthal archaeology. The tools do not suddenly become stupid, the bodies do not suddenly become incapable, the caves do not suddenly become unusable. Instead, the record begins to show gaps, contractions, and local disappearances. A people can remain competent until the very end and still lose the larger demographic game. That is why the cave bear angle is more than a headline. It gives the story a physical setting that symbolizes the pressure of the time. Cova Eros was a shelter, but not an empty shelter. It was part of a contested Pleistocene landscape. Bears used it, carnivores passed through, humans returned to it. The cave was safety and danger at once. For a late Neanderthal group, entering such a place may have required knowledge accumulated over generations. When bears hibernated, which chambers were safe, what smells meant recent occupation, which seasons made the cave useful, where to butcher animals, where to sleep, where to keep fire, and when to leave. That kind of practical intelligence rarely survives in the archaeological record, but it must have existed. These were not caricatures stumbling into caves. They were experts in a dangerous world. The comparison with Cidron sharpens the mystery because Cidron also reminds us that caves are not always homes in the simple sense. The Neanderthal remains there may have been deposited after death, perhaps moved by natural processes into the gallery, and the site became famous not because it was a cosy domestic scene, but because it preserved a catastrophe. Cova Eros, by contrast, is about occupation, subsistence, and transition. Yet both caves force us to see northern Iberian Neanderthals in intimate scale, not as the Neanderthals in a continental abstraction, but as small human groups using particular caves, particular animals, particular valleys, and particular social ties. The end of the Neanderthals did not happen everywhere at once. It happened cave by cave, watershed by watershed, kin group by kin group. There is also a deeper chronological tension. Cidron, at about 49,000 years ago, predates the final Cova Eros level by perhaps 7 to 10,000 years. That is long enough for many generations. If we imagine a generation length of roughly 20 to 25 years, we are looking at hundreds of generations between the Cidron family and the last Neanderthals at Cova Eros. That means any relationship would not be close in the personal sense. It would be population-level continuity, not a direct family drama. But in Paleolithic terms, that is exactly the kind of continuity that matters. A regional lineage can persist through shifting bands, merging groups, and changing territories without leaving us a neat genealogical trail. The descendants of a population do not have to remain in one cave. They can move west, retreat into valleys, absorb survivors, lose lineages, gain others, and still remain part of the same broad biological and cultural world. The question is whether Cova Eros represents one of those final western branches. Without DNA, the answer remains open, but the circumstantial case is strong enough for a documentary hypothesis. Northern Iberia had Neanderthals before the final transition. Cidron shows a genetically informative group in Asturias around 49,000 years ago. Cova Eros shows late Mousterian occupation in Galicia around 42,000 to 39,000 years ago. The two sites sit within a broader Cantabrian Atlantic zone, where mountains, forests, river corridors and refugial pockets could have allowed Neanderthal groups to persist after other regions changed. If Cidron is a window into the biology of these northern Iberian Neanderthals, Cova Eros may be a window into their last ecological strategy. And that strategy may have been neither primitive nor doomed in any obvious immediate way. The late Neanderthals at Cova Eros appear to have known how to use a cold, mixed environment. They hunted or processed animals, used stone tools, and returned to a cave that offered shelter in a demanding landscape. Their problem was not necessarily intelligence, technology, or even climate alone. Their problem may have been scale. Modern humans arriving or expanding through Europe may have had broader exchange networks, larger demographic reservoirs, faster cultural transmission, and more flexible alliances. A small Neanderthal group could match them locally and still be outnumbered regionally. They could know every valley and still lose the continent. This is where the usual extinction story becomes too simple. It is easy to say Neanderthals were replaced by modern humans, but replacement is not a mechanism. It is the final pattern after countless local processes have already done their work. At Cova Eros, the evidence suggests that Neanderthals survived in favourable local conditions until very late, and then, after some interval, the early Upper Paleolithic appears in the sequence. That does not tell us whether the last Neanderthals were killed, absorbed, displaced, starved, outcompeted, or simply faded after their social networks collapsed. It tells us that one kind of human presence ended and another appeared. The exact human drama between those facts is still mostly invisible. Speculating on an Cidron connection gives that invisible drama a human face. We can imagine that the Galician survivors were not isolated freaks at the edge of extinction, but part of a once wider northern Iberian population that included groups like Cidron. Some branches may have already been suffering from inbreeding and low diversity. Some may have maintained female exchange networks for a time. Some may have retreated westward into landscapes where red deer, forest and caves still made life possible. Some may have encountered incoming modern humans indirectly before ever seeing them face to face through abandoned territories, changed animal movements, new tool traditions, or the sudden absence of neighbouring Neanderthal bands. The end may have felt less like an invasion and more like the world becoming quieter. And perhaps that is the most haunting image of Cova Eros. Not a last battle, not a final scream, but a thinning. A cave once used by bears and humans continues to open into the Galician cold. Fires are lit there for a while, stone flakes fall to the floor, bones are broken, red deer are processed. Outside, the valleys still carry water, the forests still stand in patches, and the old knowledge still works. But somewhere beyond the next ridge, another group is gone. Somewhere eastward, the world of Cidron has already ended. Somewhere beyond Iberia, new people are moving through Europe with their own tools, their own networks, their own dead, and their own future. The Neanderthals of Cova Eros may have survived a little longer, not because they were untouched by the crisis, but because their corner of the world still gave them just enough shelter to continue. In the end, Cova Eros does not solve the mystery of the last Neanderthals. It makes the mystery more precise. It tells us that the final phase was not a clean line drawn across Europe, but a patchwork of local survivals. It tells us that northwestern Iberia mattered. It tells us that caves were shared spaces, ecological shelters, danger zones and memory chambers. It tells us that a late Neanderthal group could live in a cold Galician landscape at the edge of disappearance and still leave behind the signs of competence, not collapse. And when we place that beside Cidron, with its related individuals, its genetic intimacy, its signs of inbreeding and its violence, we begin to see a possible outline of the last northern Iberian Neanderthals. Small bands, old lineages, fragile networks, deep local knowledge, and a survival strategy that worked until the network around it no longer held. So when we ask whether the Cova Eros Neanderthals were related to the Cidron lineage, the most honest answer is that we do not yet know. But the better question may be whether they belong to the same disappearing world. And there, the answer feels harder to avoid. Across northern Spain, from Asturias to Galicia, the record preserves scattered pieces of a human landscape in its final chapters. Cidron gives us the family in the dark. Cova Eros gives us the refuge in the bear cave. Between them lies the possibility that the last Neanderthals of Iberia did not vanish because they failed to live like humans, but because they were human in the most vulnerable way possible, dependent on kin, memory, territory and one another, until there were simply too few others left. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.